welcome to our webinar on industrial decarbonization in a fragmented world, an effective carbon price with a climate contribution. This is jointly co-hosted by DIW and CTEX at the LSE Grantham Research Institute. My name is Cindy Matikainen. I'm the Director of Economic and Fiscal Policy at CTEX, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We have a fantastic set of panelists, a number of great speakers. So I'm just going to make a couple of introductory remarks before we begin so we can get right into the content. We'll kickstart today's discussion with remarks from the co-authors of the Climate Contribution Policy Brief, summarizing the economic, legal, trade, and international political aspects of the concept. This will be followed by perspectives from policymakers and key stakeholders from basic material production and use. Since we have so many great panelists joining us today, I am going to be strict on keeping time and asking panelists to keep their remarks to 3 minutes. I will gently interrupt at that point to move things along and hope we can pick up anything we didn't cover in the introductory remarks during the Q&A. So after the introductory remarks from the panelists, we will have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Please feel free to add these to the online Q&A throughout their presentations. We'll keep a note of them and gather them to submit to the panelists at the end. And audience members can also upvote their favorite questions. Time permitting, we'll give panelists a brief chance for final remarks and reflections before closing in an hour. So with that housekeeping concluded, I'd like to kick things over to our first panelist. I'm not sure if Philippe has joined us yet, so I might actually start with Misato Sato and Karsten Neuhoff, who are going to give us a general introduction to the concept of the climate contribution. Misato Sato is Assistant Professorial Research Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the LSE, and Karsten Neuhoff is Professor at TU Berlin and German Institute for Economic Research at DIW. So over to Karsten Misato.
Well, good morning and welcome to the discussion today. We're about to be joined by Philippe, who is going to kind of outline the issues that we currently see with the CBAM. But to start with, we outline where we are coming from in the past. So what we've seen is that emissions trading systems have been implemented as a way of supporting investments and transition to climate neutrality by effectively putting a price on carbon, giving incentives, opportunities for firms to reduce their carbon footprint in the primary production of materials, corresponding to about 70% of European emissions. That at the same time will then also increase the cost of basic materials and therefore give the business case for material efficiency, recycling, and circularity. And based on higher material prices for conventionally produced materials, this creates the business case for clean, climate-neutral production processes in the production of basic materials. This has been the ambition and the objective for a long time. And one way that what we've observed, however, is that globally, we haven't seen this rapid convergence of carbon pricing so far. Because of that lack of rapid convergence of carbon pricing, we continue to give free allocation to avoid the risk that firms are shifting to other locations because costs could be lower at the other locations. It's done now in a very sophisticated way, which retains the incentives for carbon efficiency of the conventional production, but results in less or hardly any of the carbon costs being reflected in basic material prices, and thus undermines the business case for material efficiency, efficient material choice, and circularity. But it also undermines the business case for investments in clean material production because conventional carbon material production hasn't internalized the carbon cost. Against this background, therefore, one option to go forward is to say we continue with free allocation of allowances to the conventional production. These allowances would, however, only be granted to firms if these firms are on path to climate neutrality, if they present and follow a transition plan to climate neutral production. To empower them to move to this climate neutral production, they, however, need to have a business case for each of these investment choices. And carbon contracts for differences, SD plus projects in other European countries are effectively a mechanism to support these clean production processes. If we implement such measures at the material production side, the prices of products will remain the same, the basic material products. And therefore, we wouldn't have an incentive to shift to lower carbon materials, to go to circularity and to emit material efficiency. And for this reason, the idea is to complement what we have right now, to add to the ETS directive a climate contribution that is levied on the production and import of basic materials, and therefore reflects the carbon costs also for material users. And it would only do so for the material users within our territory, in this case in Europe. And this would therefore give the incentives for material efficiency, circularity, and it creates the revenues that are desperately required to fund the carbon contracts for differences, for clean material production, and to support work with other countries together. And pass over to Misato Sato to explain this in more detail.
Yeah, so let me try to elaborate what is a climate contribution. So you can think of it as an excise duty on basic materials like steel, cement, or plastics, much like the excise duties we already have on fuel, tobacco, and alcohol, for example. So how does it work? So when you buy alcohol, the duty is calculated by multiplying the volume by the alcohol intensity or percentage. So similarly, with a climate contribution, the duty is calculated by multiplying the weight of the carbon-intensive material, the carbon intensity factor for that material, and the current EU price. So let me illustrate now with an example here. So let's say I consume a ton of steel through purchasing a car. Then assuming a primary steel benchmark of 1.8 tons and a carbon price of 75, the climate contribution I pay would be around 135 euros. And you can see here that the simplicity of this measure rests on using this standardized carbon intensity values. So what does the climate contribution do? So first, like Karsten mentioned, it really helps to restore the carbon price signal throughout the value chain. It's going to improve incentives for efficient material use and recycling, material substitution in manufacturing, construction, and for final consumption. Second, it will reduce carbon leakage risk by creating a level playing field, both at home and abroad. Similar to how an alcohol excise duty works. So on the import side, the climate contribution applies equally to both imported products and domestically produced products. And on the export side, the contribution is waived when the manufacturers export their product. Third, like mentioned, the climate contribution raises sizable and stable revenues for industry. You know, the revenues can be recycled back to industry to fund the incremental cost of cleaner production, for example, through carbon contracts for differences. And this steady revenue stream is, it's crucial to enable industrial upgrades for clean production, especially against the current political background. Last but not least, this policy is quite straightforward to administer. It's anchored in established legal and custom bases for other excise duties. That means it can, piggyback on existing legal and administrative infrastructure. And as mentioned, using standardized carbon intensity values really simplifies the implementation and also avoids the problem of resource reshuffling. I'll hand back to Karsten.
Thank you, Misato. So let me conclude on this first part that so far we have already agreed at European level that we gradually shift away from this free allocation. And you saw the difficulties that come with a free allocation. And the reason why we have free allocation so far is carbon leakage. That's why CBAM has been introduced to protect the production and the use of materials from carbon leakage risks. And this gradual transition until 2034 will in principle ensure that by 2034, we would then have a full effective system in place in terms of incentives for the transition to climate neutrality. Until 2034, however, there's this big gap of incentives and of revenues for making this transition. And therefore, the climate contribution would complement what has been implemented so far already, would levy this climate contribution at the level of the free allocation. And as the level of free allocation is gradually declining over time, so will also then the climate contribution that could be shifted then to this CBAM type mechanism that we already have in place now. This would have the big benefit, and Philip will join us a bit later, that it gives us the resilience of our overall strategy. Because right now, what we do is we insist that we internationally support developments of carbon prices such that this CBAM mechanism works. And if there's any delay, then we are struggling to see what we can do in Europe, complementing our overall system with a climate contribution and with this approaches as characterized now, enhances resilience for the situation. Thank you. Back to Zini.
Thank you to Karsten and Misato. Next, we'll turn to Roland Ismer, professor at the University of Potsdam, for the legal perspective.
Thank you very much. I'll just give you a short overview of the legal issues. Our aim really is to implement single carbon pricing for products falling within the scope of EU ETS through a measure that is legal under WTO law and EU law, and that is administratively feasible at reasonable compliance costs, and that also ensures environmental integrity. In the coming 2 or 3 minutes, I will show that the climate contribution meets the requirements regarding legality and feasibility at reasonable costs. Let me start with the legality under WTO law. WTO law prohibits both unjustified discriminatory treatment of like foreign products as well as certain subsidies. So the discrimination prohibition is contained in the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, in the GATT, and the rules on subsidies can be found in the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, the SCMA. Starting with the non-discrimination obligation. A discrimination doesn't exist, so we are on the good side of WTO law, where a domestic burden is mirrored for foreign products. So when you have a domestic burden that depends on specific emissions of the production, such as under the EU ETS, then the same, if you want to adjust it at the border, the same must in general be applied to imports. By contrast, when you have a domestic burden that depends on a general benchmark, such as the climate contribution would do, then the burden on imports just has to follow that benchmark. This is what is envisaged for the climate contribution. So we would be on the good side of the non-discrimination obligation. And regarding export relief, well, the climate contribution reflects long-established excise practice. So again, we are on the good side of WTO law. The relief for EU ETS is a bit more difficult to argue. So in sum, the climate contribution clearly complies with WTO law. Regarding EU law, legality under EU law, well, the climate contribution would be an environmental measure. It would not be primarily of a fiscal nature. See Article 192.1 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, and it can be demonstrated that we thus do not need unanimity. The measure can be adopted with qualified majority voting in the Council. Last point regarding the administrative and compliance costs. Misato has already mentioned that the climate contribution follows the excise model that's long established. Excises have low administrative and compliance costs, and we have a significant institutional expertise in tax practice. We have lots of people dealing with excises who know all about excises, so that can be easily implemented. We have a lot of expertise we can rely on. I hope I was in my 3-minute time slot, and thank you for your attention.
Yes, that was perfect. Very well done. Thank you. Next, we'll turn to Kasturi Das, professor at the Institute of Management Technology, Delhi, and Fulbright Fellow at Yale University for the international perspective. Kasturi?
Thank you, Sini, and thank you, organizers, for having me here to share my personal perspectives from beyond the EU borders. First of all, I appreciate the concern that is leading to this conversation. But as I'm supposed to talk about some concerns that might come from the trade partners, I would focus on that. First of all, I agree that CBAM has its own share of limitations, and it has also been criticized by trade partners as unilateral, protectionist, etc. Nonetheless, CBAM is up and running, and it's not going anywhere as far as I understand. Now, the omnibus package of the European Commission has also tried to streamline certain challenges. Still, from trade partners' perspectives, particularly from those in the global south, there are still a lot of challenges regarding the implementation of the CBAM, and some of which came up in the research we most recently did on impact of CBAM on steel decarbonization in India that I will be happy to share with everyone. Having said that, the question then arises is a new charge in the form of climate contribution, if it is introduced on top of CBAM, how might the trade partners look at it? Would they be able to appreciate the environmental justification underlying it, or would they again consider it to be a new form of protectionism? That is my first concern. The second is, if we look at the policy brief, it talks about a global carbon pricing progress. EU is supposed to look at whether there has been enough progress or based on that, it might decide to defer the phase out of free allocation. Now, we all know that there is no single global carbon price. So there comes the question that how might EU determine that global carbon price and whether that is sufficient or not. And that might also raise questions among the trade partners whether EU is undermining the UNFCCC principles as well as Paris Agreement's bottom-up approach. That is my second point. My third point is the policy brief also talks about this particular measure, climate contribution, will be able to, advance the climate aspect without getting into trade dispute. Now, I have a little bit of doubt over there because I think we have come a long way. And at this point, it is very difficult to think of a measure that is going to have impact on import and still not have any dispute regarding trade concerns. Because if we look at the WTO, we can see that climate-related issues are getting discussed in different forums and different committees of the WTO. So that shows the kind of intertwining of climate and trade issues. My fourth point is, while the omnibus package has tried to simplify things, adding a new measure on top of CBAM and as well as the contract for a difference might actually end up creating new set of complexities that may be a concern for the trade partners. You also mentioned that a benchmark of standardized carbon intensity value would be used. Now, how that benchmark would be determined, that may also raise a concern. Finally, in the current geopolitical scenario, I believe that it demands EU leadership on cooperative approaches for enhanced climate action rather than more conflict. And EU has always, be in the leadership position. And this is time that EU actually should firm up that position. And I think EU do well for itself and for the world beyond EU if the big picture is kept in mind before taking any decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kasturi. I'd like to turn next to Philippe Quirion, Research Director at the French National Center for Scientific Research and CIRED, who will cover some of the challenges we face with the current CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. And sorry for the delay in connecting. There are currently three major challenges which CBAM is facing. And since I have 3 minutes, I will cover each in 1 minute each. The first challenge is that the CBAM, as it is implemented, as it is planned to be implemented, does not cover exports from the EU. So it aims at level the playing field for imports in the EU, but not in third markets, and which will be maybe a problem if there is no more free allowances, and if we turn to full auctioning. It does not currently cover exports, seemingly due to concerns over WTO compliance. Refunding carbon cost on exports may either increase or decrease global emissions. It's not completely clear. And it would generate the problem that it would reduce the incentive to mitigate emissions for the production of goods exported out of the EU. But politically, it's problematic that the CBAM as it is does not protect, does not generate this level playing field out of the EU. The second challenge is that the CBAM does not cover downstream products. So it's not a problem for cement because there is no such products, but it's a problem for metals. EU manufacturers then may lose some market shares, both in the EU and abroad, because of the fact that CBAM does not cover the downstream products. If you try to quantify this effect, it's probably not a big problem for a car, since the value of embedded emissions compared to the price of a new car is relatively low. But for other less expensive products, it can be problematic, like for a car body or for other metallic products. And the third problem is what's called resource reshuffling. That is, if an exporting country towards the EU or an exporting firm produces using different technologies, some of which are more CO2 intensive than others, the CBAM as it is creates an incentive to redirect the production from the plants which are the least CO2 intensive towards the EU, while using the others for the markets outside of the EU. Doing so would not reduce global emissions, and so the target of the CBAM would be missed. So these are the three challenges that we currently face due to the CBAM, and that the climate contribution aims to address. Thanks.
Thanks so much, and very well timed. Thanks for keeping time, everybody. The final speaker for our first section is Pedro Linares, who University and Institute for Technology Research.
Thank you, Sini. And my role here is to kind of bring the perspective of somebody from a kind of a border country, from a place in Europe which is closer to our external partners, which is more exposed to inputs, but also more exposed to losing competitiveness in exports. So I think that the relief for exports, which is one of the issues affecting the CBAM, a better relief for these exports provided by an ETS reform, which includes this climate contribution, would be very much appreciated in my part of Europe. I also speak from a country with very limited physical possibilities. Basically, we don't have enough money to invest in all the transformation that our industry has to go through. And here, European funding is absolutely central if we want to decarbonize our industry. So having a stable revenue stream coming from the climate contribution dealt with at the European scale would definitely help us achieve a balanced deployment of green industry in Europe. Finally, and this is more from a pan-European perspective, not from a regional side, I think that the stronger emphasis that the climate contribution is placing on material efficiency and circularity are also critical for improving our resilience. Now, as you all know, the discussion about autonomous strategy and resilience in the face of the current international tensions that have to do with strategic materials, I think is very relevant. And again, climate contribution could play a better role compared to the current CBAM. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pedro. So that concludes the opening remarks from some of the contributors to the policy brief. So we next wanted to turn to key policymakers and stakeholders to give some of their comments and perspectives in response. So I'd like to turn first to Christoph Reisfelder, who's the Global Head of Energy and Climate Policies at Covestro. Christoph?
Yes, thank you very much for being here. Indeed, I can only mirror what has been said from the science side already on the topic. I'm representing a global polymers producer, representing the chemical industry in that sense. And it's the complexity of our value chains that are the fundamental problem or issue with the CBAM in a sense, because what you can see is that there's a trade-off between feasibility and effectiveness on the one hand. So you could argue the chemical industry is in basic quite easy. You have natural gas and oil as the basic products, but the problem is that the value chain is quite complex. It's like a tree in a sense, and it ends up in thousands of different products. So to have an effective CBAM, you would need to track basically every product. So if you do not have a MacBook in front of you, but a classical laptop, it's likely a polycarbonate casing made out of a material that we are producing. So this needs to be tracked. Your smartphone needs to be tracked, etc. So we are really discussing here tracking everything that is being imported, produced, and exported as well. So that's the one issue that we have with the CBAM. Secondly, and it was also already mentioned, the issue of exports is quite an issue for the chemical industry because it's a quite export-oriented industry. Cement industry looks a little bit different, but at least the chemical industry is a quite export-oriented industry, and hence the question of WTO compatibility for having basically a level playing field in exports is quite a crucial issue, because if we are being carbon priced within European production and the rest of the world is not being priced outside of Europe, we have a competitive disadvantage on the global market. And lastly, the challenge with the CBAM, and it was already mentioned here as a part as well, is the complexity of the value chain. Resource reshuffling is one issue. One other issue, especially in the chemical industry, is that you can jump up and down the value chain, basically. So you can circumvent CBAM theoretically rather easy in the chemical products, especially when you're discussing plastics and polymers there. So these are the fundamental challenges that we see with the CBAM. And meanwhile, a climate contribution as a rather easy concept, which could represent, in a sense, the sweet spot between this trade-off of feasibility and effectiveness, could help and could be implemented as well in the chemical industry, because it allows, in a sense, don't get me wrong, please, but a generalization on products and also on end products by going via contents in the end of the day. So that's basically an approach that would be feasible for the chemical industry, especially for the materials a part of the chemical industry. And as Professor Isma has said, it would also be WTO compliant when we are discussing exports again, because also in the current setup of the CBAM, only the importing installation is being considered, while the value chain is quite long and rather complex. And if we have the same value chain in Europe, my scope 3 emissions are somebody else's scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are being priced in as well under the EU ETS when I source my precursor products in Europe, which is not the case when imports are coming back into Europe. So there's again even a competitive disadvantage when we look into the European single market. Hence, CBAM is not a good idea for the chemical industry. It's not a good fit. But the climate contribution might work much better than the CBAM for the chemical industry. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christoph. I'd like to note we haven't seen any questions in the Q&A so far, so would very much encourage. I think we've got about a fair number of people who are tuning in, so please do put your questions in the Q&A. We'll have a few minutes at the end. I'd like to turn next to Benoit Levine, who's the Executive Director of the French Federation for Electrical, Electronic and ICT Industries. Benoit?
Okay, yes, thank you. I will try to come back to a few things that have been said. Of course, we all share that CBAM has a huge limitation, and of course, for our industry that are downstream the sector under ETS, we are completely in the scope of this risk of carbon leakage. We just made a study at the European level with Orgalim that confirm all the fear that we had about the risk. A lot of our products are concerned with huge risk of high production costs. So that's true that the main thing is risk on the downstream and risk on the export. And actually the CBAM has structural limitation that doesn't solve. And every proposal that we are listening from the Commission and from the member states, that doesn't solve the problem. So yes, your proposal of climate contribution is interesting, especially if it's in line with the WTO rules. So it will be appreciated, but we still need to study what are the consequences, because of course it could be also a problem of how we can make it in place on all the products. But the main critics that we can make to CBAM also from all side is that the problem with CBAM is that we are sweeping the problem of carbon price under the rug. In fact, we are shifting from the sector under ETS to the downstream. So actually, we have huge debate between the downstream companies, because the closer you are from the materials, you want to be in the extension because you want to be part of it, and you have no choice to be part of it. But then you are shifting the problem to the other part of the value chain, because if the next level, which is not 10,000 companies, is 1,000 and 1,000 companies are in the extension, then you put the problem at the next level, which is millions of products, millions of companies, which makes the system again more complicated to implement. So that's really a huge debate. And sometimes we have companies that are far from the materials, and they say, no, we don't want the extension, because what does it mean? If we have the extension, it will rise the cost of our inputs. So we are putting companies against each other with CBAM. So what I would like to ask to the panel about climate contribution is that we have more political problem, is that we didn't have a debate at the European level about the carbon price. First, because with the CBAM, we are blind. We are like the monkeys about the carbon price. We put it under the rug, hoping that it will be absorbed by the companies. But the reality is that we need to have the debate, is that are we collectively agree to support the carbon price? Because why did the Commission didn't take the European Commission didn't take the climate contribution at first? They could have been, but there is a political price. And we know in France that carbon taxes, all these kind of things, is very difficult to implement, because that means that at the end, if you want to have a level playing field, if you want to be fair about the carbon price, we have to put it until the final consumer. That's what we want to accept. So I think that is the first limitation of every concept about the carbon price. And the second thing that I would like to ask is that I understand that the climate contribution could solve, would be a very good idea also to have money to invest in the decarbonization. But I would like to ask you is that, have you studied the consequences after 2030 and 34 about the OPEX cost, because it can solve the CAPEX cost to decarbonization, but if there is still a real discrimination between decarbonized production of materials and carbonized production, I think we will still have problem after this period.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Benoit. I'm also noting that there are kind of implicitly some questions coming up from the panelists for other panelists, which I'm trying to take a note of, but might also come back to that after we've concluded these introductory remarks. Next, I'd like to turn to Rob van der Meer, the Industrial Policy Director at the European Cement Association. Rob?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation to this discussion, and it is an interesting discussion. But I think that we have to go back to the fundamental questions that we have to raise. What is happening in Europe on climate change, and what is the solution? Or what are the solutions? Because that is the key question that we should raise. First, the fundamental thing that is really quite challenging in this debate on climate change is the uncertainty of the legislation in Europe. I can't help it, but it is really, I said it several times, and Carsten knows it, and some other people know it. The legal predictability of the EU ETS, CBAM, whatever, is half a year. I can't help it. It's really serious. And now Vincent is in. I don't want to blame him on anything, and he knows me. But let's be honest, the omnibus regulation is having a simplification on CBAM. We were not talking about it a year before. Now, is it good or bad is something else. So improvement in legislation is not necessarily always bad. So that is not my message, but the uncertainty is bad. Second one, a fundamental one, is look at the low carbon price of today. I don't understand it, to be honest. Why is the EU ETS price that low? And does it create a business case for decarbonization in the industry, apart from all the discussions on free allocations? Sorry, at 66 euros, I don't have any business case in the cement industry for deep decarbonization. There's simply no business case. So climate contribution could be helpful in that, but I come back to that. Import and export are essential things, and perhaps not that important as for the chemical industry, Christophe, but yeah, you were in the cement industry, so you know that there is also import, and import is going rapidly higher in volume. CBAM is hopefully an instrument to that. I come back on that. But export is not solved. And that really we have to take into account. Also because of climate change. I can't help it, but the best clinker producing installations of the world are in Europe. And clinker is the basic material of cement. That's the fact. And the last point is, because I'm limited in time, CBAM. And I think the fundamental step is the implementation in time, to early 2026, is essential. And second, I made a note about it, circumvention of the measures in CBAM, for instance, resource shuffling mentioned, is an important element. So now the question is, does climate contribution help on this? First, on the legal unpredictability, I can't help it. I don't see it. And also keep in mind the climate contribution is contributing only 9 years, 10 years, not a solution. Does it help on the carbon price? Does it bring a better business case? Yes. I think that is a clear message. So that's good. Then the third one, impact on import and export. Hopefully, yes. So good. We can agree on that. And the last one is then on CBAM. Now, for that, I would say, again, yes, it could be helpful because at the end, we have CBAM. So I have a mixed answer. It is not clearly yes, it is not clearly no. But what we need for sure, and that is back to my fundamental question, second question, how do we create business case? And for me, that is what we have to have. CBAM is an essential element for it. The correct implementation of it, it is. Because otherwise you can't have decarbonization in Europe. But climate contribution could be helpful on this. So that's my input. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. Next, I'd like to turn to Mark Becker von Bredow, Director of Electrification and Climate at the German Electro and Digital Industry Association. Mark?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts on this subject. The German Electro and Digital Industry Association represents more than 1,100 companies. Our industry is characterized by a high export ratio and tightly matched international supply chains. Our companies, therefore, are not the target group of the intended protection against carbon leakage for sectors under the EU ETS, but they are directly affected by the CBAM regulations as importers and processing industries. And they are faced with all the problems discussed. The practical implementation of the CBAM and the more fundamental consequences for the international competitiveness of products made in Europe and for Europe as a business location are clearly negative. In its current form, the CBAM leads to an enormous bureaucratic burden for companies. In addition, and that's really a problem, the mandatory acquisition of CBAM certificates from 2026 on will also increase the production costs of companies based in Europe. This puts them at a further cost disadvantage compared to producers in other regions of the world, and in the end is a disadvantage in the domestic market and in third markets. So on the one hand, there are enormous implementation and transaction costs for importers, manufacturers, and public authorities, and the loss of competitiveness for European producers of downstream products like our industry. On the other hand, it is still completely unclear whether and to what extent the CBAM will achieve its intended goal of preventing carbon leakage in iron, steel, and aluminum production. That's why we conclude that the CBAM is currently neither efficient nor effective. In our view, the adjustments proposed by the European Commission are not enough. Of course, the existing reporting obligations need to be streamlined, they need to be user-friendly, they need to be fit for purpose. But we are convinced that the CBAM needs a fundamental overhaul. If the CBAM is to be continued, it should be supplemented by an instrument that supports the export of goods produced in Europe at extra cost for climate policy reasons. In addition, and that's very important for our industries, the scope of the CBAM should be extended to include more complex products, such as aluminum cables, electric motors, transformers, or household appliances. Manufacturers of these goods, products, are otherwise directly threatened by carbon leakage. And yes, these are not easy tasks. The effort would increase further and we would be faced with many trade-offs, like Benoit mentioned. So in the event of a negative impact assessment, the consequence must be to withdraw the CBAM. That's the answer. And then an alternative would be needed. Against this background, the alternative would have to be designed with a minimum of bureaucracy, as shown. The proposal of a climate contribution could be an instrument because, for example, it takes into account the export issue. And therefore, it should be, or it should not be introduced in addition to CBAM, but instead of CBAM. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Our final speaker today is Vicente Hurtado Roa, Head of Unit Energy and Green Taxation, Directorate General for Taxation Customs Union. Please, Vicente.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Edie, for the invitation. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here and try to bring CBAM closer to the audience. I mean, many things have been already said, but maybe I can give you a bit more of the perspective of where we are with the CBAM. I think I don't need to repeat, of course, what the objectives are with the measure, that it's an environmental measure, it's not a competitiveness measure or a trade measure. And I don't need to, of course, underline again that There is a transitional period until the end of 2025, and we always said from the beginning that the transitional period was meant to learn not only importers and exporters in third countries, but also for us, for the European Commission, and also for the member states to understand the implementation of CBAM before in 2026 we will be applying financial obligations. And it's from this experience in the transitional period that we are learning. First, we are helping or trying to simplify. As you know, we adopted a simplification package or a proposal to simplify already the CBAM last 26th of February. Now this is being discussed by the Council and the Parliament, and we hope it can be adopted, of course, before the end of the year. And the objective is, on one hand, to reduce the burden on many small importers of the CBAM goods. We realize, and maybe the figures are appalling, that around 90% of the importers contribute to less than 1% of the CO2 content or the emissions in the imported goods of CBAMs into the EU. And this is why we are, first of all, we are setting a threshold, an annual cumulative threshold, by which all those importers of the 4 main CBAM goods, excluding electricity and hydrogen, when they will be importing less than 50 tons per year, they will not have to be obliged to comply with the CBAM regulations. I think that's going to be a big simplification for all of us. But there will be also simplifications for those who will be above the threshold and will need to comply. And some of them are, of course, related to the different processes in the application of the CBAM. Like, for example, asking for authorizations to apply the CBAM, but also in terms of applying the methodology, in terms of reporting, of monitoring those emissions, and more importantly, also, for example, when it comes to the carbon pricing. I think one of the speakers said the certainty or the complexity with setting the carbon price. So this is why the Commission, in the same way that there will be default values for the emissions, the Commission is also considering the introduction or the publication of some default values also for carbon price, at least for those countries where there is a carbon price which is known and can be assessed. But we don't stop there. We have been listening to exporters and importers. As you know, we have reacted very quickly, for example, in the case of problems or concerns with sensitive data, and we opened a module in the CBAM registry already last January, in which third country operators can submit the data and not sharing that data with importers in the EU. But besides that, of course, we are aware, of course, that the effectiveness of the measure is important in order to achieve the objectives. So this is why we will be looking through the year, and there will be a report by the end of the year where we'll be analyzing, for example, the extension of the scope to other sectors. And I was listening to what the speaker from the chemical sectors was saying about the complexity and the feasibility. Of course, that's one of the important elements to be taken into account. We don't want to bring a measure into application which will be unmanageable. That's clear. That's why we concentrated also on a number of sectors. That possibly will come next year. Also the question, for example, of extending direct emission to the steel sector or the aluminum sector, where they are also very relevant. But then the other 3 aspects we will be looking at very carefully this year are, on one hand, the question of the risk of carbon leakage when it comes to exports of CBAM goods from the EU to third countries, in particular to countries where they are going to be exposed to the competition of goods which have not paid any carbon pricing at all. And therefore, as you will read today in the action plan for steel and metals sectors, we intend to come with a communication already before the summer with respect to some measures in this area with respect to exports. The other 2 issues which have been mentioned are, one, of course, resource shuffling and the risk of circumvention. We are working also on reinforced risk assessment with member states and measures to avoid the possibilities for circumvention. And the same goes for resource shuffling. I'm not going to explain what it is because that has been also been mentioned before. But the idea, of course, is that we analyze where the risk is and that we are able to come with, of course, with proposals to curtail or to reduce the risk of resource shuffling. And of course, where this is going to undermine the objectives of the CBAM. It's not that we don't want to, of course, invite to invest in clean technologies in decarbonisation, because this is the objective with the CBAM in the EU, but also in third countries. But well, of course, what is important is that we don't open the possibilities for loopholes and for the possibilities to pretend that companies are decarbonizing while at the same time they are contributing to increase overall or globally emissions. And the third point which was raised was, of course, downstream, the impact of the CBAM in the EU on the downstream sectors in the EU. This is something that we are analyzing, that will be part of the review. And the idea, and I can already anticipate that because that's already part of the action plan which is being published today. The idea is to come with a proposal by the end of this year where we will be covering the questions of resource shuffling and the question of the downstream goods. The rest may come in a proposal, in another proposal later on. So these are the preoccupations that we are looking at. We are very much aware of that. And I would like just to finalize by saying that, of course, what we need to make sure is that CBAM meets its objectives, its environmental objectives, and the contribution to reduce emissions globally in the EU, but also in third countries. At the same time, we see the CBAM can be also a motor or a driver for the introduction of carbon pricing that we think it's a good idea and that helps to decarbonize also in third countries. And at the same time, of course, we are working to make sure that CBAM is effective. And when we say it's effective, is that it will contribute to achieve the objectives by reducing, of course, the risk of carbon leakage. Thank you, Sini. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Vicente. I think some questions sort of came up implicitly in some of these panel remarks, but I wanted to turn to a question from the audience. Simon Sharp asked, do people agree that a climate contribution large enough to subsidize zero-emission industrial production would have a negligible impact on the price of most consumer products? Simon Sharp's S-curve economics. Karsten, perhaps?
So we calculated at a carbon price of 75 euros, which perhaps is likely in the coming years, then the revenue from a climate contribution across Europe would be around 50 billion euro. I think this would be more than sufficient to fund the incremental cost for carbon contracts for differences for the decarbonization of the primary production that will complement more and more circular economic elements in Europe. But I also believe, and I think the response a bit to what Castoria was raising, that about 20% of this revenue should be made available to support the transition to climate neutrality in partner countries that have less resources to fund such incremental costs of clean production. And the impact on consumers, Jan Stede and a few colleagues calculated that quite nicely. So it's the only carbon pricing mechanism that actually has a bigger impact on rich people than on poor people, because rich people buy more cars than poor people. So the number I just calculated, 75 euro, would effectively imply that for poorer households, their expenditure would increase by 0.3%, for richer households by 0.4%.
Thank you. There is a question for Vicente from the audience. Saul Rubens was asking, how much closer are you to getting the benchmark figure agreed to allow a rough calculation for CBAM certificates for goods to be delivered from January 1st, 2026?
Yeah, we know that there's a lot of interest in knowing the default values and all, but also the benchmarks for the free allocation. As you know, the free allowances, which are now in the ETS for some of the CBAM goods, will also be granted, or imported goods under the CBAM will also benefit from those benchmarks. We are working with the Jersey and also with a consultant on setting up those benchmarks. I have to say it takes time, I'm afraid. The benchmarks are easier in the ETS, but there are only few benchmarks in the ETS, and they cannot be applicable directly. They need some sort of conversion because of moving from an installation level to a good level. The idea is to come with an implemented regulation by the end of the year, in any case before the end of 2025, where we will be publishing, we will be including the benchmarks for the different goods for all the CN codes. And at the same time, we may come also in the same implemented regulation with the default values for the same CN codes country per country. So this is a huge work, as you can imagine. It takes a lot of time. Colleagues are very busy on that, and that's what we will be doing by the end of the year. I know that you will be not happy with that hearing this, because you will say, I need to know that as soon as possible because we need to do our calculations. As you heard what I said before about the simplifications, but I didn't mention, in 2026, and let's be clear, we are not postponing the application of CBAM from 26, but what we are doing is relaxing the obligations in 2026 basis, so that the obligation to buy CBAM certificates for 26 importations will only come from February 2027, and the obligation to buy CBAM certificates on a quarterly basis will also move to 2027, so no obligations in 26. That will give time to all of you to understand first the methodology and make your calculations to decide whether you want to rely on default values or whether you want to rely on the actual emissions. And then, of course, to finalize the calculations, you need to know the benchmarks. And you also need to know whether there was some sort of carbon price paid at the source. With all of those elements, you will be able to make a better assessment. So I think the flexibilities will also give you some time to do all these calculations, possibly at the beginning of next year.
Thanks so much. I think one question that came up during the panel was whether this climate contribution would be a replacement to the CBAM, or if it could be a replacement. I think it might have been Mark who said that, if I remember correctly. I don't know if Carsten or Masato, you wanted to respond to that. If it was somebody, if I'm misremembering who asked on the panel if they wanted to elaborate, but I think it was Rob or Mark, but I think it might have been Mark. But
so I think the CBAM has been, in the assessment of a lot of people, very effective in contributing to a global debate on carbon pricing and climate action. And I think to maintain this momentum, it is quite valuable. My sense is it can manage carbon price differences if they're moderate. So if the CBAM is successful on triggering global carbon pricing across the world, then it will be effective to kind of balance the remaining volatility differences between carbon prices in regions. And so that expectation actually to retain this instrument for this international momentum is quite valuable in the debate. At the moment where we effectively only have in Europe a 75 or 60 euro carbon prices and not somewhere else, I think the CBAM isn't strong enough to manage this. And so for this period, we need a bridging instrument such that in Europe, the transition to a clean economy, that we have an investment framework in Europe, we call it, I think now, the Clean Economy Deal in Europe, Clean Industrial Deal. I think there we need to have a robust investment framework, and that's where the climate contribution could be part of a concept to manage this bridging period until the CBAM then in the longer term can take over.
Benoit, did you want to react to that?
Oh, it was just a question because I heard from Mr. Hurtado that, of course, they want to stick to 2026 and not to postpone. But from our perspective, if there is no solution for downstream or export, how can you say that you are not postponing the CBAM? Because carbon leakage for the downstream industry is beginning in 2026. And we cannot imagine that we put in place a solution, we put at risk the industry and wait for, we'll wait 3 years to see if there is a risk, and then we decide. I think it's a real issue.
May I react to that, Simi? Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm not sure if I understood exactly what you mean by the risk. I suppose you are referring to the downstream goods. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The idea is that we come with a proposal by the end of the year. The problem is that, the situation is that any proposal by the Commission has to be finally adopted by the Council and the Parliament, and that takes time. Of course, I understand that both Council and Parliament are very much keen on this one, so I think that would be adopted very fast. Then we can decide whether the measure applies to those goods in the middle of 26 or from 2027. I mean, everything will depend on when it's adopted. But let's be clear. I mean, the impact of CBAM also from 26 will be gradual, in the sense that, as I mentioned before, that as long as the free allowances are there, only imported goods will have to pay CBAM with respect to the difference between their carbon intensity compared with the benchmark. So, for example, if we are importing goods from a country X, where their carbon intensity of the goods is even lower than the benchmark, there is no adjustment. So we think that in 2026, the impact of the CBAM will be relatively low because of the free allowances, and that gives us also time to do that. Of course, we agree with you. We think that some of the downstream goods have to be included. We can discuss whether the list has to be longer or not. We are analyzing, because we need to do a good assessment to take into account a good balance between where the risk of carbon leakage exists, and also the feasibility, and also the keeping the measure under management, manageable, because what we don't want is to increase also the administrative burden a lot. So I think that bringing or including the downstream goods by the middle of 26 or in 2027 will not be too late. I don't think that will be an impact. In any case, as long as there is a proposal by the Commission, I think that the market will already start adjusting to that, and I think that all stakeholders will be anticipating the application of the measure. But there is a real interest, Benoit, I can tell you, in including downstream goods, and that will be part of the list. That's for sure.
Thanks so much, Vicente. We're exactly at time. I think this has been a really great discussion, as given the co-authors of the climate contribution, a lot of interesting things to think about. So thank you so much to all of the panelists for joining. It's been great. Thanks to everybody who joined online. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's questions, but thanks so much for joining. Have a good afternoon.